Chapter 1. The Night My Parents Chose My Sister. 4 years ago, my own father looked at me and said I was not worth the investment. My parents paid every dollar for my sister's elite university, while I worked before sunrise just to afford classes at a public school. They thought they had already decided which daughter was the smart investment. But on graduation day, in front of thousands of people, the university called a name my parents never expected to hear: my name. And when I stepped onto that stage as the commencement speaker, the same family who once said I wasn't worth investing in had to sit there and watch the return on the decision they made about me. The night my parents decided my sister was worth the investment and I was not, started like any ordinary dinner in our house. Nothing looked dramatic at first. The plates were still on the table, the kitchen light was warm, and my father was standing near the counter the same way he did when he explained business numbers. If someone had walked past our house in Raleigh, North Carolina that evening in the fall of 2017, they would have seen a normal family finishing dinner. But that quiet moment was the night my life quietly split into two different directions. My name is Alyssa Carter, and I have a twin sister named Brianna. From the outside, we looked almost identical. Same height, same brown hair, same last name on every school form. But inside our family, the difference between us had always been clear, even if nobody said it out loud. Brianna was the one people remembered. She spoke easily. She laughed loudly. Teachers liked calling on her. Coaches praised her confidence. At family gatherings, relatives asked Brianna about her plans and then turned to me with polite smiles, as if I were the quiet background of the same story. I learned early that my role was to be dependable. Brianna's role was to shine. That afternoon, both of us had opened our college acceptance letters at the kitchen table. Brianna read hers first. She had been accepted to Redwood Hills University in California, a private school that people in our town talked about with a kind of admiration that sounded almost like envy. It was the kind of place where people built networks and careers before they even graduated. My father leaned forward as Brianna read the letter out loud. When she finished, he smiled in the way he usually reserved for successful business deals. My mother hugged her and immediately began talking about campus visits and dorm shopping. Brianna laughed and said something about finally seeing the Pacific Ocean. Then both of them looked at me. I opened my envelope carefully. I had been accepted to Piedmont State University in Greensboro. It was a strong public university with a respected economics program. I had spent weeks researching it. I felt proud when I said the words out loud. "Good school," my father said. My mother nodded and asked what the dorms looked like. Then the conversation moved on. At the time, I thought we were simply saving the financial discussion for later. After dinner, my father asked us to sit down in the living room. He stood near the coffee table with his hands folded together, the way he did when explaining company decisions to his employees. "We need to talk about college finances," he said. Brianna leaned forward immediately. My father looked at her first. "We will cover your full tuition at Redwood Hills, housing, travel, and everything you need to get started." Brianna gasped and jumped up to hug him. My mother laughed and said she had already started looking at flights for orientation weekend. For a moment, the room felt warm and celebratory. Then my father turned toward me. "Alyssa," he said calmly, "we have decided we will not be paying for your college." The sentence hung in the air like something heavy that had suddenly been dropped in the middle of the room. I blinked. "What do you mean?" I asked. He spoke slowly, the way he did when explaining something he believed was perfectly logical. "Your sister has a stronger presence. Redwood Hills will open more doors for her. It makes sense for us to focus our investment where it will create the most opportunity." Investment. That word landed harder than anything else he had said. "And me?" I asked quietly. He paused only for a moment. "You are smart, Alyssa, but Brianna is the one people remember. She stands out." My mother kept her eyes on the carpet. Across the room, Brianna was already texting friends about California. I watched her smiling at the phone screen while my father calmly explained why my future was not worth funding. "So what am I supposed to do?" I asked. "You can apply for scholarships or loans," my father said. "Many students do." He said it the way someone might explain a minor inconvenience. The conversation ended there. No shouting, no apologies, just a quiet decision. I walked upstairs to my bedroom and closed the door. For a few minutes, I simply sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall. Then memories started rearranging themselves in my mind. The brand new car Brianna received on her 16th birthday, the leadership conference she attended in Chicago while I spent that summer working at a grocery store, family vacations planned around Brianna's sports tournaments and social events, the gifts she opened every birthday that made everyone laugh and clap, the practical things I received, like textbooks and winter coats. Each moment had seemed small at the time. Together, they formed a pattern that suddenly felt impossible to ignore. Downstairs, I could still hear my parents laughing with Brianna about dorm life in California. I opened my laptop and searched for the tuition costs at Piedmont State. The numbers appeared in neat rows: tuition, housing, meal plan, books. I grabbed a notebook and started writing. Scholarships, work-study programs, part-time jobs near campus, student loans. I wrote every possibility down carefully. The strange thing was that I did not feel angry yet. What I felt was something colder: clarity. My family did not lack the money to help me. They lacked the belief that helping me was worth it. That difference changed everything. Around midnight, I closed the notebook and leaned back in my chair. For years, I had believed that if I worked hard enough, my parents would eventually see me clearly. That night, I realized they already had. They just did not see someone worth investing in. Downstairs, Brianna was still talking excitedly about beaches and dorm parties. My father sounded proud. My mother sounded relieved. I turned off the light in my room and lay down on the bed. The house looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but something inside it had already shifted. My parents had made their decision about which daughter deserved their support. What they did not understand was that their decision would become the first moment that pushed me to build a future none of them had expected. And that future would eventually bring all of us back into the same room again in a way none of us could see yet. Chapter 2. 4 hours of sleep and a cup of coffee. The following fall, I arrived in college with 2 suitcases, a backpack full of second-hand textbooks, and a bank balance that made every dollar feel important. I enrolled at Piedmont State University in Greensboro, North Carolina, in August of 2018. The campus was bigger than anything I had experienced before. Red brick academic buildings surrounded wide lawns where students walked in groups that looked relaxed and confident, as if they had always known they belonged there. I did not feel that way yet. Most freshmen were moving into dorms with their parents helping carry boxes and bedding up the stairs. I watched those scenes from the sidewalk with my 2 suitcases and a map of campus folded in my hand. Dorm housing cost more than I could afford. Instead, I rented a small room in an aging house 4 blocks away from campus. The house leaned slightly to one side, and the hallway light flickered when someone turned on the kitchen sink. My room held a narrow bed, a desk that wobbled if I leaned on it too hard, and a single window that looked out onto a parking lot. But the rent was cheap. Cheap meant possible. My schedule started before sunrise. At 4:30 every morning, my alarm rang in the dark. By 5, I was unlocking the doors of a campus coffee shop called Copper Mug Cafe. The smell of espresso and burnt toast filled the room before the sun even reached the windows. The morning supervisor was a graduate student named Derek Lawson. Derek had the tired calm of someone who had been balancing school and work for years. On my first week, he watched me stack cups behind the counter. "You move like someone who has done this before," he said. I smiled. I'm just trying to keep up. The morning rush always began around 6:30. Students hurried in for coffee before their first lectures. Professors stopped by carrying stacks of papers. Some mornings it felt like the entire university passed through that cafe. I handed drinks across the counter and listened to conversations about internships, family trips, and plans for spring break. Those things belonged to a different version of college than the one I was living. When the rush slowed, I wiped tables and checked the clock. At 8, I ran across campus to my economics lecture. Classes filled most of the middle of my day: economics, statistics, and policy analysis. Those rooms were the only places where I felt completely steady. Numbers followed rules. Data made sense. Work returned in the evening. On weekends, I cleaned study lounges and hallways in one of the residence halls through a campus custodial program that paid a little more than minimum wage. Every part of my schedule was built around survival. One afternoon, Derek watched me rub my eyes while the espresso machine hissed beside us. "You look exhausted," he said. "Just adjusting," I answered. "How many hours of sleep did you get last night?" I shrugged. "Enough." He gave me a long look. "That means not enough." I laughed quietly and poured another cup of coffee for a student waiting at the counter. The truth was that I rarely slept more than 4 hours, but slowing down was dangerous. If I stopped moving, I would hear my father's voice again, telling me I was not worth the investment. So I kept moving. The exhaustion caught up with me one Friday morning in October. The cafe was packed with students rushing between classes. The sound of voices blended with the sharp hiss of steam from the espresso machine. I was carrying a tray of drinks toward a table when my hands began to shake. The room tilted slightly. I tried to steady the tray, but my vision blurred. A hand grabbed my arm before the cups slipped. "Easy," Derek said quietly. He guided me behind the counter and pushed a chair toward me. "Sit down." I shook my head. "I'm fine." "Your hands are shaking," he said. "That is not fine." He handed me a cup of water. "How many hours of sleep last night?" I hesitated. 3, maybe? He exhaled slowly. "If you pass out in the middle of this cafe, do you know what happens?" I shrugged. "Someone calls an ambulance?" He said. "And then you get a bill you cannot afford." I stared at the floor. The truth in his words felt heavier than the exhaustion. After a moment, he slid a new schedule across the counter. "You were taking 1 extra morning off each week," he said. I started to argue, but he raised his hand. "This is not charity. I need employees who stay conscious during their shifts." I nodded quietly. That small adjustment helped more than he probably realized. But money was still tight. That winter, there were nights when dinner was a vending machine sandwich and a cup of coffee from the cafe where I worked. I learned how to stretch a bag of groceries across an entire week. Strangely, those small hardships never made me angry. They made me focused. November arrived, and with it, the quiet week of Thanksgiving. Campus emptied almost overnight. Parking lots became silent and dorm windows went dark. Most students went home. I stayed. Plane tickets were impossible on my budget. On Thanksgiving afternoon, I called my parents. My mother answered the phone. I could hear dishes and laughter in the background. "Happy Thanksgiving, Mom," I said. "Happy Thanksgiving, Alyssa," she answered. "Is Dad there?" I asked. "Yes." "Can I talk to him?" I heard her cover the phone and say something quietly. Then I heard my father's voice somewhere in the distance. "Tell her I am busy." My mother returned to the phone. "He's helping your aunt in the kitchen." "That's okay," I said. "Tell him I said hello." We ended the call a minute later. Out of habit, I opened my laptop and checked social media. The first photo I saw was posted by Brianna. My parents were sitting beside her at the dining table, 3 plates in front of them, 3 smiling faces. The caption said, "Grateful for family." I stared at that picture longer than I expected. Then I realized something simple. They had not forgotten about me. They had simply not made space for me. I closed the laptop and walked back across the quiet campus to the library. The building was almost empty. I sat down at a desk near the window and opened my notebook. Instead of studying statistics, I began writing something else, an essay about economic mobility and opportunity in the United States, about how people start from different positions and how access to resources shape the paths they are able to take. I wrote quickly. The words came easily. It felt less like an assignment and more like explaining my own life through numbers and research. When I finished, it was almost midnight. The following week, I submitted the essay for my economics seminar. A few days later, my professor asked me to stay after class. The lecture hall emptied while I waited near the front row. When the last student left, he held up my paper. "Where did you learn to think about data this way?" he asked. I shrugged. "I just tried to be honest about what the numbers were saying." He studied me carefully. "There's a national program called the Sterling Fellowship," he said. "Students from universities across the country compete for it every year." I almost laughed. That sounds like something for students with perfect transcripts and impressive resumes. He set the paper down on his desk. "Programs like that are looking for perspective, Alyssa. Your work shows perspective." "Students like me do not usually get chosen for things like that," I answered. He leaned back in his chair. "Adversity does not disqualify a candidate, Alyssa. Sometimes it's exactly what makes the work meaningful." I left the classroom that afternoon holding my essay. Outside, the sun was lowering behind the campus buildings. For the first time since the night my parents made their decision, it felt like something unexpected might be opening in front of me. I had no idea yet that this small essay would eventually lead me straight back to the place my family believed I never belonged. Chapter 3. The Sterling Fellowship application changed everything. The Sterling Fellowship application slowly became the most serious challenge I had ever faced, and it began with a quiet meeting inside Professor Whitaker's office. His office looked like every academic office I had ever imagined. Tall shelves filled with books, a desk covered with papers, and a window looking out across the center lawn of Piedmont State University. He held my essay in one hand while studying me carefully. "You wrote this differently than most students," he said. "I just wrote what I understand," I replied. He leaned back slightly in his chair. "Most students try to sound impressive. You tried to explain something real." I did not know what to say to that. Then he placed the paper on his desk. "The Sterling Fellowship is not just a scholarship," he said. "It is a national academic track, research, mentorship, and partnerships with several universities." I felt a small knot form in my stomach. That sounds like something for students who already have perfect records. He shook his head slowly. It is for students with direction. That conversation changed the course of my year. Within 2 weeks, he invited me to assist with a research project studying student debt inequality and economic mobility across the United States. For the first time, I stepped inside the university research lab. Rows of computers filled the room, and graduate students worked quietly at long tables covered with data reports. Professor Whitaker introduced me to a doctoral candidate named Maya Shah. Maya looked through the early draft of my research proposal and tapped the page with her pen. "You think clearly," she said, "but you write like you are apologizing for your own argument." "I am not used to this kind of environment," I admitted. She smiled slightly. "Then get used to it." From that day forward, Maya became the person who pushed my work harder than anyone else. My life became a careful balance of responsibilities. I still opened the Copper Mug Cafe most mornings before sunrise. After the morning rush, I hurried across campus to my classes. In the afternoon, I worked in the research lab analyzing datasets and building arguments for our project. Late at night, I wrote sections of my fellowship portfolio. research summaries, policy analysis, impact statements. Each piece had to be precise. Every skill I learned felt like climbing one more step away from the place my family believed I belonged. One evening, Maya looked over a draft and crossed out 2 entire paragraphs. "This part sounds defensive," she said. "I explained the problem," I replied. "It explains your frustration," she answered. "That is not the same thing." She handed me a report from the Federal Reserve. "Use evidence. Let the numbers speak for you." I rewrote the section that night. Months passed like that. Progress came slowly but steadily. Then the crisis arrived. It happened late one evening when I logged into the university finance portal to review my tuition account. The screen showed a balance I had not expected: $6,800. For a long moment, I simply stared at the number. For many families, it would have been manageable. For me, it felt like the edge of a cliff. If I could not close that gap, I would have to pause my studies. Working full-time might allow me to pay the balance eventually, but I knew the risk. Students who stepped away rarely returned. The next afternoon, I knocked on Professor Whitaker's office door. "I might have to take next semester off," I said quietly. He set down his pen. "What happened?" I explained the tuition gap. He listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned forward. "You are approaching this problem emotionally," he said. "I do not see another option," I replied. He tapped the stack of research papers on his desk. "You are building an argument for national policy reform. Start thinking about your own situation the same way." Later that evening, Maya joined us in the research lab. Professor Whitaker explained the problem. Maya read through my fellowship application draft again. Then she looked up. "You buried the strongest part of your story." I did not want it to sound like a complaint. She shook her head. "You are not complaining, you are providing context." Together, we rewrote the impact section of the application. Instead of hiding the financial pressure and long work hours, we framed them as proof of persistence and perspective. Economic mobility was not just the subject of my research, it was the life I was living. When the application was finally finished, it felt less like a scholarship form and more like a legal case. I submitted it near the end of January. Then came the waiting. By March, I had already convinced myself that the answer would be a polite rejection. One quiet afternoon, I was sitting in the campus library when my phone vibrated. The email subject line read "Sterling Fellowship Committee." My heart began to pound. I opened the message slowly. I expected to see the word "unfortunately." Instead, the first line said, "Congratulations." For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen. The committee had selected me as one of the national fellows. The program included funding, mentorship, and access to advanced academic tracks at several partner universities. One of those universities was Redwood Heights University in Northern California. The name stopped me for a moment. Redwood Heights was the same university my parents had once described as the best investment for my sister. Through the fellowship, I had the option to transfer into one of their research tracks if my work aligned with faculty projects there. After discussing the opportunity with Professor Whitaker and Maya, I decided to take it. In the fall of 2023, I transferred to Redwood Heights. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell Brianna. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted one achievement that existed without their expectations shaping it. The Redwood Heights campus looked exactly like the brochures people admired back home. Stone buildings surrounded quiet courtyards. Students walked between seminars carrying books and laptops with the calm confidence of people who expected to succeed. One afternoon during my first week, I stood outside an honors seminar room studying the list of enrolled students posted beside the door. Footsteps approached behind me. Then a familiar voice said my name. "Alyssa." I turned slowly. Brianna stood there holding 2 textbooks against her chest. Her expression froze in disbelief. "What are you doing here?" "I transferred," I said. She blinked.
I thought you were still at Piedmont. I was. For a moment, she said nothing. Students passed us in the hallway while she tried to understand what she was seeing. You never told anyone, she finally said. I did not advertise it. Her eyes moved from the seminar list back to my face. In that moment, something shifted between us. For years, our parents decided which one of us mattered more. Now we were standing in the same place without their judgment defining the difference. And I realized the real conflict between us was no longer about who had been chosen. It was about who had become someone they could no longer control.
Chapter 4. When the balance started to shift. Life at Redwood Heights did not slow down after that moment in the hallway with Brianna. If anything, the atmosphere between us changed in a way that was quiet but impossible to ignore. I had come to Redwood Heights with a very simple goal: finish my degree, complete the fellowship research, and move forward with my life. I was not chasing attention. But attention sometimes arrives when your work begins to stand on its own. During my second semester, my research on student debt mobility was selected for presentation at the West Coast Undergraduate Economic Forum in Seattle. When the email arrived, I stared at the screen for several seconds before I believed it was real. Students from several major universities were presenting there. Many of them had been preparing for academic careers since their first year of college. I forwarded the email to Professor Whitaker. He called me early the next morning. "I told you the research mattered," he said. "I still feel like I am catching up to everyone else," I replied. "You are not catching up," he said calmly. "You are building momentum." The conference took place in March. When I stood at the podium and began explaining the data model I had developed, the nervousness faded after the first few minutes. Numbers were a language I understood. After the presentation, several students approached me to ask questions about the research. One of them looked through the summary of my paper and said something that surprised me. "I read this before the session," he said. "It explains mobility better than most graduate papers I have seen." It did not feel like praise. It felt like confirmation that the work had value. Back at Redwood Heights, something else began to change. Faculty members started mentioning the research during seminars. One afternoon, I walked past an open lecture hall and heard Professor Levin speaking to a group of students. "If you want a strong example of debt mobility modeling," he said, "read Alyssa Carter's paper." I stopped in the hallway for a moment. Hearing my name spoken that way was unfamiliar. Recognition had never been part of my life before. But recognition has consequences when someone else has always been the center of attention. Brianna had built her reputation at Redwood Heights through personality and connections. Professors remembered her easily. Students liked working with her on projects. At first, she treated my presence like a curiosity. Then the curiosity turned into something sharper. One afternoon, after an honors seminar, she stepped into the hallway as I was leaving. Students moved around us while she folded her arms. "Are you trying to outshine me?" she asked with a half smile. For a second, I thought she was joking. Then I saw the tension in her eyes. "I am trying to survive," I answered. She frowned. "What does that even mean?" "It means everything else is your interpretation." She looked at me for several seconds without speaking. The hallway slowly emptied while we stood there. Then she shook her head slightly and walked away. That conversation changed the dynamic between us. A few days later, my phone buzzed while I was reviewing research notes in the library. The message was from Brianna. "Is your name really on the honors candidate list?" I read the message once and then typed a short reply. "I am finishing my work." The response seemed to frustrate her more than any argument would have. Over the next few weeks, she began asking questions around campus. She asked classmates if they had seen the internal GPA rankings for the honors program. She asked a professor how the Honors Council evaluated research impact. She was no longer ignoring what was happening.
What neither of us realized was that the ripple was beginning to travel beyond the university. Late that spring, my parents attended an alumni reception in Portland, Oregon. The event was organized by the Alumni Foundation to connect local graduates with community donors. My father rarely attended academic gatherings, but Brianna had mentioned the university often enough that my parents decided to go. During the reception, my father spoke with a man named Andrew Keller who worked with the Alumni Foundation. They talked about business and community programs for several minutes before Keller mentioned something casually. "We've been hearing about a student named Alyssa Carter recently," Keller said. "Her research has been making waves in the economics department." My father froze for a brief moment. "Alyssa Carter," he repeated slowly. Keller nodded. "Yes, she presented at the West Coast Undergraduate Economic Forum earlier this year. Very impressive work." For a second, my father did not respond. Then he forced a polite smile. "There must be many students with that name." Keller laughed lightly. "Perhaps, but this one is definitely someone to watch." The conversation moved on, but the thought stayed with him. Back at Redwood Heights, the semester was moving toward its final weeks. Research presentations, final evaluations, and honors reviews filled the academic calendar. One afternoon, I received a formal email from the administrative office. "Dean Catherine Doyle and the Honors Council would like to meet with you regarding your academic portfolio." The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. When the day arrived, I walked into the administration building with a calm I did not expect. Dean Doyle greeted me professionally and invited me to sit at the conference table. 3 members of the Honors Council were already there. The conversation lasted about 20 minutes. They asked about the methodology behind my research. They asked about the policy implications of my findings. They asked how I managed the balance between fellowship work and coursework. I answered as clearly as I could. When the meeting ended, Dean Doyle stood and shook my hand. "Thank you for your time, Alyssa," she said. I left the building without any idea what their decision would be. 2 days later, I was sitting alone in the campus library when another message appeared on my laptop. The sender line read, "Office of the Dean." My heartbeat slowed as I opened the email. The message was short. The Honors Council had selected me as the commencement speaker for the graduating class. For several seconds, I stared at the screen without moving. Commencement speaker. It meant standing on the stage in front of the entire graduating class, their families, and the faculty. A moment no one in the audience could ignore. I closed my laptop slowly. Somewhere in that audience, my parents would almost certainly be sitting beside Brianna. They would come expecting to celebrate her graduation. They would not expect to see me standing at the podium. And for the first time, I understood that the sentence my father once said so casually was about to return to him in a way he could not dismiss. The night he told me I was not worth the investment was finally about to meet the moment he would have to watch me prove otherwise.
Chapter 5. The Day They Heard My Name. Graduation day arrived in May of 2024, beneath a bright California sky that made the stone buildings of Redwood Heights glow softly in the afternoon light. The stadium was already filled when the graduates began walking toward the field. Thousands of families filled the seats, cameras raised, voices echoing across the stands as names were called and students found their rows. I stood with the other graduates near the entrance tunnel, waiting for the ceremony to begin. The air smelled faintly of grass and warm sunlight. Some students laughed nervously. Others adjusted their caps again and again. 4 years earlier, I had sat alone in a small rented room, wondering if I would even finish college. Now, I was standing inside one of the most respected universities in the country, on the day everything would finally come together. When the graduates began walking onto the field, I searched the audience for a familiar face. It did not take long to find them. My father sat in the front section with a camera around his neck. My mother sat beside him, holding a program in both hands.
Brianna sat between them, talking to friends and smiling in the way she always had when she knew she was the center of attention. They believed they had come to celebrate her graduation. For a moment, I watched them quietly. I did not feel anger anymore. What I felt was something steadier. Clarity. The ceremony began with music from the university orchestra. The sound carried across the stadium as the graduates took their seats. Faculty members stepped onto the stage, and the audience slowly quieted. Dean Catherine Doyle approached the podium and began speaking about the graduating class, about resilience, and about the responsibility that comes with opportunity. Her voice carried clearly through the speakers. Then she paused and lifted a small card from the podium. Each year, the Honors Council selects a student to deliver the commencement address. The stadium grew quieter as she continued. This student represents academic excellence, perseverance, and a commitment to using knowledge to create opportunity for others. She looked up from the card. Alyssa Carter. For a brief second, there was silence. Then the stadium erupted into applause. From where I sat, I could see the front rows clearly. My father lowered his camera slowly, as if his hands had suddenly forgotten what they were doing. The camera slipped slightly against the strap at his neck. My mother remained completely still. Brianna turned around in her seat, searching through the rows of graduates. When her eyes finally found me, the surprise on her face was impossible to hide. I stood and began walking toward the stage. Each step felt steady. The noise of the stadium faded into the background as I climbed the stairs and stepped behind the podium. Thousands of people were watching. I took a breath and looked across the audience. 4 years ago, someone told me I was not worth the investment. The stadium grew quieter again. I did not say a name. I did not need to. But education is not something reserved for the people who look impressive at the beginning, I continued. Sometimes the people who are overlooked are the ones who learn how to keep going the longest. I spoke about students who worked late shifts before early classes, students who studied in libraries because they did not have quiet homes, students who kept moving forward even when no one believed they would succeed. Opportunity should never depend on who someone believes you are before you have the chance to prove it. When the speech ended, the applause rose again, louder than before. I stepped away from the podium and returned to my seat while the ceremony continued. But my thoughts were already somewhere else. After the final diplomas were handed out, families flooded onto the field. Cameras flashed and groups of graduates hugged each other while parents searched through the crowd. I was walking near the edge of the field when I heard my name behind me. Alyssa. I turned. My father stood a few steps away with my mother and Brianna beside him. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then my father cleared his throat. We may have made a mistake. The sentence sounded small compared to the years that had passed since the night he first made his decision. We did what we thought was practical at the time, he continued. I met his eyes calmly. Practical would have helped both of your daughters build a future, I said. What you did was preference. My mother stepped forward slightly. We did not think you would reach this point. We did not know you could. You did not know because you never looked. The words were not angry, they were simply true. Brianna stood nearby listening. She slowly lowered herself on the edge of a bench behind her, as if the weight of the moment had finally settled in. My father looked down for a moment before speaking again. We are proud of you. Pride is easy after the result. Support matters before it. None of them replied. After a moment, I spoke again. Love is not what people say. Love is what people choose. And you made your choice. I was not closing the door completely, but I was no longer standing there waiting for them to open it. After a few quiet moments, we said goodbye and went in different directions across the field. That evening, I walked through the Redwood Heights campus one last time. The stone buildings glowed in the light of sunset. People took photos near the fountain, and laughter echoed across the courtyard. People passed me and said my name with warm congratulations. not because I had finally proven something to my parents, but because the work had spoken for itself. A few months later, I moved to Seattle to begin working as a policy analyst at the Northwest Economic Policy Institute. The research focused on education access and economic opportunity, the same questions that had shaped my own journey. Life continued to move forward. In early 2025, I used part of my fellowship funding and my first year of savings to create a small scholarship fund for first-generation college students. $50,000 to help students who might otherwise hear the same words I once heard. Because I knew how deeply those words could stay with someone, and I knew how powerful it could be when someone decided you were worth the investment after all. Sometimes I still think about that moment in the stadium, not the applause or the speech, but the quiet realization that the people who once doubted you don't get to decide what your future becomes. And that leaves me with one question I'm always curious to hear other people answer. If you were standing where I stood that day, hearing the people who once said you were not worth the investment suddenly say they were wrong, what would you do next? Would you forgive them and begin again? Or would you keep your distance and build your life on your own terms? If you value stories where strength is quiet but unshakable, subscribe and comment.